Hi, this is Jennifer from Read It Again. Come sit with me while we read Mr. Putter and Tabby Stir the Soup by Cynthia Rylant. Consider subscribing and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you'll get notified when I read the next book. Mr. Putter and Tabby Stir the Soup by Cynthia Rylant, illustrated by Arthur Howard. Chapter 1, Soup Day. Mr. Putter and his fine cat Tabby lived in an old house with an old porch and an old swing and lots of old things inside. Mr. Putter and Tabby didn't mind old things. They were old too, so they felt right at home. One of the oldest things in Mr. Putter's house was the stove. Mr. Putter was very attached to his stove. He called her Bessie. Every day, Bessie cooked up oatmeal and tea for Mr. Putter and Tabby. Some days she cooked up muffins, and on really special days she cooked up soup. Mr. Putter and Tabby loved soup. But it was a lot of trouble. Mr. Putter never had all the right ingredients at the right time. No onions, he would say to Tabby. No soup. Or, no beans, he would say. No soup. And sometimes, no macaroni. No soup. Tabby was really sorry about the macaroni. It was her favorite part. But one day, when Mr. Putter and Tabby wanted soup, Mr. Putter found he had everything. "Look, Tabby," said Mr. Putter, "even macaroni." Tabby purred and purred. Today would be a soup day. Look at all those things they put in their soup. Yum. Chapter 2, Maybe Not. Mr. Putter put everything on the counter and started chopping. He chopped up celery. He chopped up carrots. He chopped up potatoes. He chopped up onions and cried and cried. Tabby worried and rubbed against his legs. "Don't worry, Tabby," said Mr. Putter. "It's just the onions." He smiled and gave her a pat. Tabby felt much better. Mr. Putter dumped all of the chopped things into a big pot of water. He turned on the stove to let them cook, but nothing happened. Bessie didn't warm up. She didn't warm up even a little. She just sat there, cold and quiet. "Oh no," said Mr. Putter. "Bessie's on the blink. Now what do we do?" Mr. Putter looked at Tabby. Tabby looked at Mr. Putter. They both looked at Mrs. Teaberry's house through the window. Said Mr. Putter. Chapter 3, Neighbors. Mrs. Teaberry was Mr. Putter's friend. Her good dog Zeke was Tabby's friend. They all liked being neighbors, and Mrs. Teaberry loved to cook. "Maybe Mrs. Teaberry will help us make soup," said Mr. Putter. He phoned her up. "Mrs. Teaberry," said Mr. Putter, "Bessie's on the blink, and I'm trying to make soup." "Oh, dear," said Mrs. Teaberry. "May Tabby and I make soup at your house?" asked Mr. Putter. "Well," said Mrs. Teaberry, "I'm just on my way out to shuck oysters with the girls." Mrs. Teaberry enjoyed odd things. "Can you make your soup with Zeke in the house?" she asked. "Of course," said Mr. Putter. "He'll be good," said Mrs. Teaberry. "Of course," said Mr. Putter. "He'll be nice," said Mrs. Teaberry. "Of course," said Mr. Putter. "And he promises not to be a bother," said Mrs. Teaberry. "Oh, Zeke's not a bother," said Mr. Putter. "We'll be right over." Chapter 4, The Bother. Mr. Putter and Tabby carried all of their soup things over to Mrs. Teaberry's house. Zeke met them at the door. He had a leash. "No walk, Zeke," said Mr. Putter. He and Tabby went into the kitchen. Zeke came in with his ball. "No ball, Zeke," said Mr. Putter. Mr. Putter started chopping tomatoes. Zeke came in with his stick. "No stick, Zeke," said Mr. Putter. Mr. Putter started chopping turnips. Zeke came in with a potted plant. "Jiminy," said Mr. Putter. Mr. Putter and Tabby chased Zeke all over Mrs. Teaberry's house. Finally, Zeke gave up the plant. Mr. Putter put it in the bathtub where Zeke couldn't reach it. "No plant, Zeke," said Mr. Putter. He and Tabby went back into the kitchen, and Mr. Putter started chopping parsley. Zeke came in with the radio. "Jeminy," said Mr. Putter. Mr. Putter and Tabby chased Zeke all over Mrs. Teaberry's house. Finally, Zeke gave up the radio, and Mr. Putter and Tabby went back to the kitchen. He put it back in the bathtub. Zeke came in with a lamp. "Jiminy," said Mr. Putter. That was a very interesting morning. Chapter 5, Soup. When Mrs. Teaberry finally got home, Mr. Putter was asleep. Tabby was asleep, and Zeke was eating a carrot. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Teaberry. Her house looked a little different. It was missing things. She looked through all of the brooms. Then she looked in the bathtub. "Oh dear," she said. Mrs. Teaberry looked at Zeke. "Were you a bother?" she asked. Zeke wagged. There was a lot of stuff in the bathtub. Mrs. Teaberry went into the kitchen. Poor Mr. Putter. His soup was still not cooked. And there was a lamp in the kitchen sink. That's a little dangerous. Mrs. Teaberry got to work. She made raisin bread and chocolate fudge and melted cheese toasties. I guess that's grilled cheese. And she stirred Mr. Putter's soup all afternoon. When Mr. Putter woke up, they had the most wonderful meal and the best soup Mr. Putter and Tabby had ever tasted. "I'm sorry Zeke was a bother," said Mrs. Teaberry. "Oh," said Mr. Putter, "Zeke is never a bother." "But have you seen my hat?"